a couple of little things before we begin the sermon. I want to call your attention to, in your order of service, is our monthly newsletter, the Plowshare, and there's one in your order of service right now, and I just encourage you to read through that at some point, not right now maybe, but there's some important information there. There's an update on our search for an assistant minister. There's an update from our board president, Solly, and there's an update from our treasurer, Beth Ann Wilson, all stuff that we should know about in the congregation. Other two things I want to just call your attention to is that we have an upcoming Path to Memory class that happens on January 18th, a couple of Saturdays from now. Wonderful way to spend a Saturday morning and meet some amazing people, and we really had a good time in that class. And then lastly, there's a Bright Spirit Path class which starts up in February. It runs on Tuesday nights, and that is the class you should take if you are curious about, how to actually live your life as a Unitarian Universalist. What does it mean to live a spiritual life as a Unitarian Universalist? That's what we do in 5 weeks in that class. So just want to call your attention to those briefly. Now then. I am an honest person. Those who are less honest than I am are liars. And those who are more honest than I am are, they're kind of annoying. And I'm patriotic too. Those who are more patriotic than I are just jingoists, and those who are less patriotic than I probably don't even deserve America. And I'm very moderate. Those who are more moderate than I are fence sitters, and those who are less moderate than I are hotheads. And I'm peaceful. Those who are less peaceful than I are warmongers. Those who are more peaceful than I are weak. And I'm frugal. Those more frugal than I are cheapskates, and those less frugal than I are wasteful, and I am extremely tolerant. Yes, oh yes, those less tolerant than I are bigots, and those more tolerant than I have no boundaries at all. I'm very loving. Those less loving than I are selfish, those more loving than I are just sentimental. I have very good taste. Those who have better taste than I are trendy, and those who have worse taste than I watch the stupidest stuff on television. I'm very faithful. Those more faithful than I are fundamentalists, and those who have less faith than I are lost. I'm quite committed. Those less committed than I have no initiative. Those more committed than I are diehards. And you see, I can say all this because I'm the man in the middle. And I know that's true because where I stand defines where the middle is. And I bet the same is true for you. So I did not write that piece I just shared with you. I just like it, and I like it today because it holds up something else that I want to share with you, which is that we really like to be right. Like all of us. Like really, really like to be right. And probably every single one of us really and truly believes that we are right about any number of things, from economics and politics to which political party is best, to how children should be raised, to how we should conduct ourselves on this journey through life, with the little caveats of within the context of our particular language and our particular culture and the particular social norms of our time and our family heritage. We think we're right about whether or not there's a God and how we should relate to her. We generally believe we're right when it comes to our judgments about other people, their character, their habits, and their intentions. And probably functionally at least, for the most part, we probably are right. Functionally at least. Enough of the time so that we don't attract too much attention. Except for those times when we're wrong. So here's a cute story about being wrong. Years ago, I was on a road trip with some buddies, and we'd been on the road for hours and hours, and we're getting kind of silly in the car, and we're singing to each other some of the worst songs we could remember from the 1970s. And if you remember that time, you remember there was some like really bad music back then. And my friend Scott said, "Oh, I've got one," and he began singing. He said, "Nutmeg, there's no need to feel down." I said, "Nutmeg, get yourself off the ground." I said, "Nutmeg, 'cause you're in a new town. There's no need to be unhappy." Nutmeg. It kept us going for 100 miles. Karen Schultz tells the story of driving across the country when she was in college, taking the long way through back roads and state parks all the way from Rhode Island to Oregon. Somewhere around South Dakota, she finally asked her friend something that had been bothering her for days as they drove across the country. She said, "So, like, what's up with that Chinese character we keep seeing on the road signs?" And her friend is like, "What? What Chinese character?" "You know, that Chinese character we keep seeing on the road signs, what's it for?" Her friend was like, "I don't know what you're talking about." And it finally dawned upon them. Karen had been confused by the symbol that the National Highway Department has chosen to be the universal highway symbol for a picnic table. So one of my personal favorite stories of being wrong, some of you will remember Muriel Mills, who was born into this church in 1911 and was memorialized right here in this room in 2007. And it is doubtful anyone will ever surpass her record of 96 years of nearly continuous attendance at First Unitarian Society of Denver. Now, when I arrived in 2002, she was usually here on Sunday mornings. And my interactions with her were always, well, let's just say brusque. Short and to the point. She was absolutely clear. She had no use for trivialities, no use for small talk. My experience was that she was pretty hard to talk to. I knew that she was in her 90s. I knew she had never married or had children. I knew that she loved history. I knew that she lived alone. I knew that there were some sisters and some nieces somewhere, but she never talked about them, at least not to me. So I had this picture in my head based on this limited experience that, well, frankly, Muriel was kind of a curmudgeon. And whether by choice or by circumstance, someone who was fairly isolated and not well connected with people. In fact, here's my favorite story about Muriel Mills. When my very first year here, I was making it a point to call and go visit all the elders of the congregation. And so I called Muriel one day and told her I wanted to come and see her. She said, "Wednesday morning. You can come Wednesday morning." When I showed up on time, she took me in, she sat me down at her kitchen table, she sat down across from me, she said, "Okay, what do you want?" But when she passed away, and when Reverend Betty Pingle and I met with her 3 nieces to plan her memorial service, I discovered I could not have been more wrong about Muriel Mills. These nieces, these 3 fully grown, very accomplished, very smart, very savvy women were all in tears over the loss of their aunt. And every one of them told how present Muriel had been in their lives, how hard she had been on them when they were little, how thoroughly she had insisted that they be strong and smart and independent, how she'd given them math puzzles for birthday presents when they were young. They were so proud of her, how she had traveled the world, even behind the Iron Curtain of East Germany during the Cold War. So proud of what a highly respected teacher and author of high school textbooks she had been, how they had discovered her when she was 90 years old at the family cabin. They had gone and they'd found her actually using a table saw to repair something in the cabin. Muriel Mills was deeply connected and deeply loved, and I could not have been more wrong. So it's kind of interesting if somebody getting something wrong, is the very essence of every novel, every movie, and every TV show you've ever seen. All right? From what I can see, every single one of these is a variation on somebody getting something wrong, somebody making a bad decision. That's what they are. And we just eat this stuff up, right? As long as it's happening to somebody else. So I'm using examples of being wrong that are humorous and pretty easy to let go of. But the truth is that we human beings, we really hate to be wrong. I mean, we really hate to be wrong. In our culture, being wrong is embarrassing and frequently even disgraceful. But we get things wrong all the time. Like all the time. We make bad decisions about our health and what to eat. We make bad decisions about our relationships. We make bad decisions with our money, in our parenting. I do those all the time. We aren't fond of dwelling on past mistakes, but like how many of you right now, where you're sitting this morning with your current view of the world, how many of you could name 3 things that you're wrong about? No way. And of course, that's like a loaded question, right? Because if you knew you were wrong about it, you'd be right about that. But anyway. The point is that there's a weird kind of an undercurrent in our lives when it comes to being right or being wrong. We know from experience that we're capable of being very wrong about all manner of things, but we go about our lives as if we're right about pretty much everything. Karen Schulz wrote, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, think for a moment about what it feels like to believe that you're right. What that means is that you think or you believe that your perceptions of reality are a perfect fit of reality. And when you feel that way, that's great, but then you've got this problem of all those other people, right, who disagree with you. It turns out most of us explain those people with a series of assumptions about them that are usually just wrong. First thing we usually do when someone disagrees with us, we just assume they're ignorant. They don't have all the information they need, and if they did, they would, of course, agree with us, because that's what the facts point to. And when it turns out they do have all the same facts and they still disagree with us, then we go to the second assumption, well, they're just freaking idiots. Or Democrats, or Republicans, or something like that. And when it turns out that people who disagree with us have all the facts we do, and they're actually pretty smart, then we move to the third assumption. They know the truth, they're just deliberately distorting it for their own malevolent purposes. So this sound familiar? Does this sound like politics in our country? So this is a social and political disaster. Too often, the internal sense of rightness that we all experience is not a reliable guide to what's actually going on in the external world. And when we act like it is, when people and institutions stop entertaining the idea that we might actually be wrong, that's when we end up making huge and costly mistakes. Like, that's when we end up dumping 200 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. That's when we end up threatening the global economy over a healthcare law. That's when we end up messing with the planetary climate that actually sustains our very lives. This is a huge practical problem. I would argue that this whole dynamic is actually kind of killing us, both as a culture and as individuals, partially because of what we see and experience out there in the world, all this conflict, all this inability to resolve conflict, all this inability to admit that we might be wrong, partially also because we're all complicit. This weird need to be right and this weird, deep fear of being wrong, I believe places the equivalent of an emotional and spiritual weight around our necks, individually and collectively, makes us afraid to speak up, encourages us to hole up in our homes, has us reading only the internet sites that tailor to what we already believe, and stay isolated in communities with the people who think just like we do. And I would argue that when we do this, we are getting it all exactly wrong. So what's the faithful thing to do? I'm going to offer three suggestions. First, we could become a bit more mature about our need to be right and our fear of being wrong. The Chinese image of the yin-yang symbol is very powerful and very instructive. Remember, as the circle that's divided in two in a curve, there's white and black, and each of them contain an element of the other. There's this understanding that we need both sides. We need all sides. The wholeness is not complete without all sides. Jonathan Haidt speaks of two stanzas from Zen master Shen Song as being the deepest insights ever attained by Eastern religion and by moral psychology. Two stanzas. If you want the truth to stand clear before you, never be for or against. The struggle between for and against is the mind's worst disease. And perhaps unfortunately, it's a disease that many of our national leaders have caught. But before you feel superior to George W. Bush for drawing lines in the sand, before you throw a stone, ask yourself, do you really accept that idea? Could you wrap your mind and your heart around this idea? Could you really step out of the battle for good and evil? Could you really not be for or against anything? Could you pull your perspective back further? Now that all seems very serious, but to me a short way of getting at that same idea is, and this is my first actual suggestion, we could all use to take ourselves a little less seriously. I'll take an amen for that. Secondly, second suggestion, we could speak more carefully and more respectfully in all of our interactions. I have no better advice on this than what I learned from Rabbi Lawrence Kushner. He says he never witnesses to his faith or enters a political conversation by saying, I think you're wrong and let me tell you why. Right? He has 3 steps that he uses for these conversations. He begins with, this is where I'm coming from. And this is where it leads me. And this is why I find it satisfying. Totally different conversation. This is where I'm coming from. This is where it leads me. This is why I find it satisfying. I have found that approach actually makes possible conversations that I otherwise wouldn't even start, even within my own family, about things that that I know we disagree with. Third, we could listen better. And I can't say this any better than Kelly Woodford wrote in a blog post that I saw last week. She wrote, earlier this year, several of my friends were in a hot debate about feminism. I sat on the outskirts and watched, and more than anything, the truth that I saw through all the insensitivity and injury was that each of these people had a story they wanted to share. The ones who were anti-feminist had experiences that confirmed their beliefs. The ones who were outspokenly pro-feminism had other stories, ones that would curl your hair with the injustice done. We have unique perspectives. Each of us has a window, a lens, and to nullify someone's personal take on truth is disturbingly close to complete disregard for the sacredness of their story. We need these stories. We all need these stories. Perhaps if we valued our brothers and sisters' lives for what they are, narratives being scripted for the whole of humankind rather than relegated to one side or another of an argument. Remember the yin-yang. Perhaps if we see these narratives are being scripted for the whole of humankind instead of relegated to one side or another of the argument, perhaps then we could unplug our ears, soften our hearts, close our mouths, and grow in compassion. Perhaps we would, in the process, find God in unexpected places. God, I believe, likes to show up in unexpected places. Amen.
Please rise in body, word, and spirit. Join in singing hymn number 212, Sing Sarah's Circle.
Our congregation